right, let's go ahead, folks. Good morning. Welcome to the August 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications in the South Atlantic. And most of you all are familiar faces and probably know that we host this web forum every third Thursday of the month here at 10 a.m. And it's intended to give people like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of our region. So here's our usual agenda. I'll start out by introducing the speaker, then we'll have our main presentation, followed by Q&A and discussion. And then I'll take some time to preview next month's webinar and share some updates from your Blueprint staff. I'm going to go ahead and put us in silent mode so that we don't have background noise this morning, but I'll unmute us during the Q&A so that it's easier for us to chat. If you need to speak up at any time during the presentation, you can press *6 to unmute your line, and you're always welcome to pose questions using the chat box, which I'll be keeping an eye on during our presentation. So before I put us in silent mode, does anyone have any questions or comments?
The conference is now in silent mode.
All right, so Rua will be giving our talk today. I imagine most of you already know Rua as the science coordinator for the Blueprint here in the South Atlantic. So he's going to be going over some of the updates that are coming out for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS, this fall. So Rua, it's all yours. You can go ahead and I'm passing you the presenter power and just press *6 to unmute your line.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Welcome. So I'm going to give you an update on what's coming up in the fall Southeast Conservation Blueprint update. I was going to talk about 4 things. I think it was in the announcement. Wanted to talk about progress towards an integrated ecosystem report card. This was part of setting up an overarching goal for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. I think that's I'll be talking more about that in the next few months. Very excited. I think that's coming along very nicely on setting kind of an overarching ecosystem goal for all of this. So I'm going to talk about this progress towards integrated ecosystem report card. Then a little bit about the version 3.0 of the Southeast Blueprint, that update. And then a few other additional data layers we're working on to accompany that for the fall. Some integrated threat layers and also integrated hubs and corridors layer. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to go through each of them. And maybe I think I'll just, since it's not going to be super long, maybe I'll just pause at the end of each of them for questions. And so maybe Hillary will just unmute people after each section, something like that. Yeah, cool. All right. So step 1, progress towards that integrated ecosystem report card. So what we've been doing to help figure out what this overarching goal for the strategy should be was pulling together all these different ecosystem assessments. So take a first cut at integrating all these existing measurement systems we have and roll-up assessments we do both at the sub-region and then nationally and regionally to get a first cut of, okay, well, where are we at right now and where do things seem to be going? That way we can set something that's actually ambitious but achievable at that larger goal. And this is, first cut, certainly not perfect, but was designed to provide some helpful context about the ecosystems in the region and how we're doing. So what it did was pull together some of these different sub-regional ecosystem assessments. Some of them you'll probably be familiar with, the Everglades Restoration, Chesapeake Bay Report Cards, State of the South Atlantic, a few Mississippi River Watershed Report Card, Tennessee River Basin, some of these different sub-regional assessments we have that dive into one place, look across the ecosystem, and roll up a bunch of data-driven indicators to synthesize how the systems are doing. And here's basically some coverage. I'm not showing this, still working on getting the right shapefile for the Everglades version of that. So this is just kind of general coverage of what we have for sub-regional assessments. We're hoping to get the Gulf Coast report card for Texas Gulf Coast, but that's gotten delayed, so we're not going to be able to have that for right now. So that's just kind of what we've got for these assessments at the sub-regional level. And then if you just kind of put those out, just simple, what are they saying about some of these different regions, and kind of put them on the same playing field. This is about what the assessment scores come up with condition-wise. So Everglades, actually, I just got the 2017 and I haven't updated this, so the Chesapeake is a little bit, should be a little different. But this is about what the scores come out to. So this is out of 100. That's the best possible score for all of these. Then there's these assessments that have this national/regional coverage. Most of them are national, but then have kind of regional breakdowns of the assessments. So now we're covering this whole area. And so that's things like the rivers and streams assessment, coastal condition, fish habitat partnerships through a fish's eye, state of the beach, Forest Service regional planning assessment, state of the birds, the NOAA state of the stocks, or looking at marine fish. So in this case, these are ones that have sub-regional breakdowns that we can look and have broader coverage across the whole area. And so this is what the scores look like for, our best approximation of this sort of southeast region. And so you see beaches a little bit lower than some of the fisheries and national fish habitat, coastal condition. So this is about where when you kind of take all these, pull them out of the assessments and put them together in a very, very simplified way. All right, so where are we now? Now, the simplest, but I would argue not the best way to do this is to just let's just average across all these assessments. Okay, the sub-regional ones, the national ones, you put them all together, and this is kind of the state of the ecosystems of the South. Now, there's a problem with doing that, not just the kind of uneven coverage of some of the sub-regional ones, but also the fact that some of these assessments are really around one or two kind of ecosystems. So, coastal condition is really looking at some of those coastal waters, but it's not telling you anything about the uplands. And so, same thing with some of these other, like rivers and streams. It's about rivers and streams, not all the ecosystems of the South. So it made a little bit more sense as a starting point to average across the ecosystems. So let's just take a look at broad ecosystem types and then see how each of those are doing based on assessments that actually cover those components. And there's a million ways to do this. You can area weight it. There's lots of ways to slice it. So what I would say is don't worry too much about the exact numbers here in an initial assessment, but a few general trends, regardless of how you slice it, come out from what we have so far. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those, but things like the pine and prairie ecosystem tends to score pretty bad compared to everything else, and the marine estuarine tend to score a little better as we go. So averaging across ecosystems a little closer to apples. I mentioned we've got a few other versions where you area weight them or do some other components. But this is kind of a first cut at how we might put them together and slice them up by ecosystems. Then if you average across the ecosystems, across all of them, that's another approach to get it at maybe where we are right now. All right, what about trends? So where are these things going? That's a snapshot in time across a number of assessments. So a few, not all of them have good trend lines, but one of the things across all these assessments you start seeing is that the aquatic assessments are relatively stable or increasing. So this is an example from the Chesapeake. I've now got it updated, if you've seen the slide before, to 2017. And this was actually the first year they found it's increasing. This is the first year they found a statistically significant increase over the whole time series. So the Chesapeake is actually getting better, which is pretty exciting given the huge amount of development that's happened in that watershed. So despite all the increases in development, they've been able to actually keep the Chesapeake. They've been able to improve the condition of the Chesapeake, which is pretty awesome. But this is sort of indicative. This is coastal condition, which has been relatively stable over time. And so if you look at the top is the South Atlantic, the bottom in red is the Gulf, and the dotted line in the middle is kind of average across the full region. And so that stayed relatively stable over time. And I think a lot of you probably heard some of the stories, or have lived some of the stories where, you used to go into some of these rivers and they were, completely dead and full of chemicals. And so in general, a lot of the aquatic stuff tends to be relatively stable or increasing, which is good to see. On the opposite side of it, the grassland open pine system seems to be really getting hit the worst and seeing more decline than this upland hardwood forested wetland side. So in the uplands, a good example of some of what seems to be happening comes from this state of the birds. Now this is national. I'll show it southeast region in a second. But you can sort of look at this trend here. And so this is bird population trend and that sort of zero line, the darker gray. Oh, I went wrong way. There we go. So what you're starting to see is that wetland birds are doing better over time nationally. Forest birds are actually starting to decline less. So you're starting to see some recovery in forest birds. And grassland birds are still really in trouble. So we've seen these kind of some of these recent turnarounds, but that sort of grassland, open pine, that's that pine and prairie species, they're still having trouble despite all the investment and the time we're putting into them. So that's what we were seeing from a national level, but what does that look like for the Southeast most recently, like over the last 10 years to try to get a trajectory? So for our first cut, went into the breeding bird survey trends for the Southeast from 2005-2015. That's the most recent. It's available through the fancy statistical assessments. And basically went by the species that were most broadly shared as species of greatest conservation need in state wildlife action plans, and just kind of went down the list that were broadly shared across the South. And all of the ones I went through, that basically kind of went down top 5, all of their trends were either stable or increasing. So wood thrush, prothionotary warbler, Louisiana wood water thrush, worm-eating warbler, those trends across the Southeast were stable or increasing, which is kind of interesting. And we anchor a little bit on the past. And so if you go back and you start looking at the 90s up to the early 2000s, and some of these trends were different. So that is, I think, something why we keep looking and seeing how things are changing. But that was interesting that all of those were not doing too horribly. But then when I went to the pine and prairie birds, again, same thing, just broadly shared across wildlife action plans, went in order, ones with the most states. Every single one of them was still declining. So even over the last 10 years, that decline, they're not leveling off at this much lower level. They're all still declining. Bob white, Bachman sparrow, loggerhead shrike-field sparrow, all of those ones are still declining. So really, it definitely kind of highlights which of these systems are getting the most hammered. And, I mean, those pine and prairie uplands, hard to maintain with fire, and they're ripe for development. So that's the other thing that's come out of some of these trends assessments. Okay, so that's just a quick view of a few of the big high-level things. Next steps. So as I mentioned, this will support goal setting this fall for SECAS, and the idea is to actually do an assessment about the state of the South's ecosystems every year. What's the latest we know on trends? What's the latest we know on condition? See how close we're getting to the goal. So that's the idea. So every year in the fall, plan to have something together. There's a few really interesting ways to slice up some of these data, and I kind of teased a couple of them in a bigger assessment. So you can slice up the integration based on ecosystems, like I showed before. How's the pine and prairie doing? How upland forest doing? How's the marine environment doing? You can do that same thing, but also split it up by subregions. How's the South Atlantic doing? How's the Mississippi Valley doing? How's the Texas Gulf Coast doing? So that's another axis. And there's also been working on breaking it down on these broad indicator types. So how is water quality doing across the South? How's terrestrial connectivity doing across the South? How's aquatic connectivity doing across the South? So that's another way we can slice these things up in the future. So I would say there's going to be likely a more polished assessment coming out next fall as part of reporting on the goals. This was to scope kind of early experimenting with some approaches, but I think it's likely we'll have something that's a little more integrated and polished coming out for the next release. All right, questions on any of that before I move on to the next product?
I'm going to unmute everybody here.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So if you want to speak up, you can just manage your own mute with your phone. So anyone questions for Rua after this first section?
Rua, this is Gino.
Hey, Gino.
How difficult is it to compare these indicators? You may have mentioned that in the beginning, but it just seems like people would be using different indicators in these different studies. I'm just wondering how difficult it is to look across them and come up with a similar metric.
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on which indicator and how well it comes together. Some of the water quality ones are not too bad because there are some kind of standard assessments that go across the geography, and some of them are a little trickier. So I think some will be able to get the connectivity one. I think I'd like to explore a little more. I think there's some aquatic connectivity and terrestrial. I think there'd be some opportunities for that might be doable, but it really just depends on the metric, as you might expect, how well they come together. But it is a lot like, the idea is a lot like how we do hurricane forecasting, right? We don't pick one model as gospel, and those hurricane predictions, they'll often track things in slightly different ways and have various quirks in their models about what they do or they don't. But then we ensemble them together in the most logical way and then push them forward. So I think in some cases, some stuff we may not be able to do yet. And then the stuff we can't, I think that's an opportunity to look at these assessments and have conversations across the folks that are doing it to see, is there any way we can do them in a way that'll help them add up a little better. But some of them are actually not too far off. But we'll see in more detail as we kind of put them together a little bit better. But it was interesting to see how I was expecting actually more differences than I found in putting some of these things together.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
All right, we can keep on rolling. If you got something, you can always save it for a second, and then we'll have another break in a second. So yeah, that's next steps on that. The next thing is the update for the Southeast Blueprint, and so this is the latest draft of that coming up. The only difference right now in this next version is that we've now completed all of Texas. So we integrated the Texas Chat, Crucial Habitat Assessment tool in there, and that's the way we plug in. That's in Oklahoma and also plugged into the rest of the Western connections. And so again, this is draft. It'll be officially out and finalized after the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies meeting. That's out in October. But this is the draft we're working with right now, and it's actually so the cool thing is that this is the first version of the Southeast Blueprint that actually covers the entire region we tried to. We always had this West Texas area for the last few versions that we're missing. So we now have that area covered. Everything else stays the same. We were hoping to get some of the new connectivity work going on in the center of the Southeast Blueprint, but that's not quite going to be ready in time. That'll probably be the next update. So that's really the only change on deck, is finishing off Texas right now on this next update. So that is where we're at with, I would expect some bigger changes in the next version after that. Questions on the update of the Southeast Blueprint? Oh, one other thing I was going to mention, as you noticed, definitely had some discussion amongst the points of contact around, do you call this the SECAS Blueprint, which some people have called it, or do you call it the Southeast Blueprint, which other people have called it, Southeast Conservation Blueprint? And so the recommendation coming out of that group would be to call it the Southeast Conservation Blueprint as a product of the SECAS, Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So that's why you hear me saying Southeast Blueprint. That was the recommendation from that group. Okay, now, any questions from the group about this update?
We're still in talk mode, so feel free to speak up. Just please be mindful of muting your line. I'll put us back in silent if we start getting background noise. But anybody have any questions for Rua on the blueprint?
Gino again, just looking at this image, Rua, it looks like perhaps Texas used a different threshold level than other areas.
Yeah, it's a little harder to slice up. One of the things, it's the same threshold within Chat, but they just end up with the intersection. It ends up having kind of a higher. That's kind of one of the issues. It's going to be one of the known issues in this next one, is that, as you can see, Texas is a little over prioritized. We're using the same threshold that we use for the rest of the Chat, but it just, when you combine that with the other design in Eastern Texas, it just includes so much stuff that it's a little over prioritized. So we're working with Dwayne German from Texas Parks and Wildlife and a few other folks to see how we can best address this issue. So we may actually tweak Texas specifically to fix that, or just work on syncing up some of the efforts. So yeah, that's definitely one of the works in progress on that side of East Texas.
So am I understanding you right, Rua, this is Hillary, that each of the input data sets that we're using to create this blueprint in Texas does cover the same threshold? It's just that when you add them together, because there's a lot of areas where they're different, that the sum of them is a higher percentage?
Well, the chat, so the way we use the same rules for the chat, which is across all of the different places, but each state has different levels of what they call, how much they include in chat 3 versus chat 1 and 2. And when you combine those three together, Texas has more than some of the other neighboring states. Plus, when you add in the additional sort of Gulf Coast prairie design on top of them, which captures other places, you end up with a lot more.
Gotcha.
So that's one of the things we're still working out, and so that may change in the final version depending on discussions with Texas folks. So yes, Gina, that was the first thing that jumped out at me too as we were putting these things together.
Any other questions for Rua about the blueprint?
The other thing that also comes up is that, and I know that's still in the marine area around Florida is still in the works. We were hoping it might be close to ready for this update, but it looks like it's going to be the next update, and hopefully we'll be able to have that extended marine prioritization wrapping around the state of Florida and then into the Gulf. I think it sounds like, given some of the stuff going on with the regional planning bodies in the Northeast, that integration with an integrated plan in the Mid-Atlantic and North Atlantic is less likely than it was last year or the year before. But I think Florida is a good possibility for the marine environment for next update too. All right.
That sounds like you can roll.
Cool. All right, rolling. So next thing, integrated threat layers. This is another thing we've been trying to work on, is trying, just like we did with the Southeast Blueprint, to try to have some schemed up threat layers that can cover the South. And so there are 3 threat layers that are likely to be ready in the fall. And so those 3 I've got up here, not the final pictures, but just some visuals. Sea level rise, urban growth, and climate velocity. And I'll go through each of those. There's a few. So for sea level rise, there's the NOAA sea level rise models that are going to be the base. There are some other sea level rise components, especially some SLAM modeling in the Gulf and some stuff that Florida have done that we're working on, trying to figure out the best way to integrate those together. So we'll see how much we can integrate in time for the fall release, but we're pretty confident we'll have something for sea level rise. Urban growth, same story. In this case, we've got the sleuth urban growth as a base. But at the same time, there are some national urbanization predictions and some local ones up in Virginia and into Florida that we've been looking into how to connect them together. In some cases, especially the one coming at the Northeast, I think, Gina, you mentioned this before, connecting the indicators. The kind of function and structure of those models was so different, and the results and how they're working, that it might be pretty difficult to integrate some of the Northeast stuff. That was more of a, not apples and oranges, but maybe apples and a sofa bed. So that's going to be a little tricky. But we'll figure out, like I said, we'll figure out the best way to integrate the urban growth, and we'll see how far we go. But pretty confident we can get something up for urban growth. And then the third one I have here, this is climate velocity. This comes out of the Vital Futures Project for the Southeast Conservation Strategy. And so what climate velocity is it's basically saying, well, how far does an organism have to move to keep up with the change in temperatures? And so this darker red here, you don't have to move very far, up in the Appalachians. So you're thinking you're up in a mountain environment. How far do you have to move? Well, you have the elevational gradient, so you can stay in your same temperature niche by just moving. Whereas as you go farther, as moving into a lighter spectrum, up on some of the coastal plain and other areas with less relief, you have to just physically move farther to keep up with climate. So that's another thing we're working on. That should be up and have that velocity layer. That'll likely be ready for the fall. And what we're talking about doing, just like the Southeast blueprint, is kind of having a little subfolder in there. So you go to the Southeast, or the South Atlantic blueprint, where we've got, here's the blueprint, and then here are threats, and here blah, blah, blah. We're talking about having that same thing for the Southeast blueprint, where you can go there and you can have, here are the priorities, here are the threat layers, and here are some other things too. So those are likely to be ready for the fall. And there's a few more we're working on that might be ready for the fall, looking into some different energy development ones we can do. So possibly some energy development layers. Agricultural conversion, there's a few options there of things we might be able to put together. And then also future flow alteration. So there's pretty good, starting to be pretty good coverage of these kind of future in-stream flow and flow alteration models across the region. And so we've done some pre-work on integrating, looking at them in overlap zones, figuring out how they're different and why. And so if any of you are, work in flow ecology or hydrologists or anything like that, know that putting together some of the flow stuff gets kind of complicated. But we're working on that. So we may have something by the fall that's kind of a stitched together future flow that covers, I don't think it's going to capture Texas and Oklahoma, but we could get a pretty healthy chunk of the South from that future flow alteration. But we'll see. That's something that's in the works. So those are some things in the works, and I will stop again for any questions on that.
Fire away, folks. Rua, this is Linda Reimer. Is energy development looking at the construction of solar arrays or wind farms or both or something else?
Yeah, so shale, gas, wind farms, solar, kind of looking into options for all of them. I actually have the most, I know where to get for wind, there are sort of the wind energy layers that we have out there and possible development. So there's a few good things on wind. Solar, I've got the locations, the most recent up-to-date locations, so the points of where all the solar, and I've been doing some assessments. It was kind of interesting. I'll talk about that later, about how much of that is occurring in priority blueprint areas, because a lot of people have called that out of sort of like, hey, some of these solar areas are going into important conservation areas, and that is certainly, I forget what percentage we're going into blueprint areas, but I started running some numbers on that. So we're looking into solar, better than just like, where's their sun, but, where's solar energy development likely to occur? So yeah, trying to get a few of those different layers available. So that's the energy piece we're thinking about.
That's great, because in some SURPASS discussions, I've heard Georgia DNR people talk about how the solar arrays are going up in prime gopher tortoise habitat in Georgia.
Yeah, they're definitely, when you look at the percent, it doesn't seem as bad, but then you look at the number, I have to pull up my exact numbers, but there are a number of solar farms that have been put up in what are high priority blueprint areas. So yeah, definitely seeing that regionally, in addition to what we're hearing a lot of in Georgia and starting to hear of in other states. So trying to figure out a better way of getting at those threat layers than just where's their sun.
And that's a great example, too, of how the blueprint can be used as a plan to help you identify places that are suitable for development, as well as use it as a plan to identify areas that are the highest priority for conservation. If you kind of look at the inverse, what's not blue, maybe those are places that we would want to focus those types of development impacts.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
I actually have a question, Rua. Could you go back to the climate velocity map? So does this capture at all, areas where in the mountainous regions, like you were talking about, you might not have to move as far, but eventually you can run out of elevation if you're up at the top, if climate change gets extreme enough that some of those species would not be able to migrate any further. Is that captured in this model?
Not in this one. This is just how far you have to move, not will you eventually run into something where you can't move, because that's a species-specific kind of thing, too. But yeah, it does definitely, it only looks at how far a generic species would have to move. So it's more about how many different sort of climate zones are nearby you.
Mm-hmm.
And Hillary, thanks. This is Linda again. I was going to ask about the climate velocity. So this is just pure temperature?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this one's pure temperature.
Why don't you call it climate temperature velocity?
Okay, that's a good question.
Temperature velocity.
Yeah, I can talk with Adam Tarando in that group and see. I think that's just generally how it's been referred to. But yeah, I don't think it doesn't get at rainfall or there's other things. So yeah, that's a good point.
For us simple-minded folks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is helpful to clarify. It's just looking at one dimension of climate. So
yeah. All right. Other questions?
I say move on, Rua. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end if other things occur to you folks. So
moving on. All right, so the last one is this integrated hubs and corridors layer we're trying to do. So not all of the Southeast Blueprint has this sort of formal hubs and corridors network embedded in the analysis, but we're working on sort of pulling out the parts that do and trying to put them together in a way that might be able to, if you just want to look at the sort of hubs and corridors and connections, you could do that. And so that's something we're working on putting together. So this was an initial first cut at putting them together, where you took the sort of hubs and corridors from 4 of the inputs, the Nature's Network and Naturescapes from the Appalachian and the Northeast, the South Atlantic, and then Peninsular Florida. So the darker green are hubs, the lighter green are corridors. We're still trying to figure out the best way to do the hubs down in Peninsular Florida, because their ecological greenways network is just depicts the connections and broad swaths of corridors and doesn't really explicitly define hubs. We are hoping to there's a connectivity project going on that's supposed to improve the blueprint in the central part of the South, so covering Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, West Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, that area. And so it's not quite going to be ready for the update cutoff, but it's close. Should be ready in a few months. And so that's another layer that we would have for hubs and corridors to try to come up with this integrated layer. So that's what we're working on. Should have something by the fall release of these SECAS products of a sort of the best, most logical integration of these different layers. And the idea of a lot of this integration stuff is that the individual layers are up there, but if you need a hub and corridor layer, you need a threat layer that cuts across these broad areas. Instead of you having to worry about it, we're trying to bring together all the folks that are involved in these different layers and then figure out what's the best way to put it together and document it and get it to you, so you don't have to fuss with that and have something that's already integrated in the best possible way for you. So that's where this one is. I'm guessing the only stuff we'll have for this release will be this eastern part, but hopefully not too long after that we'll be able to update and fold in that more central part with hubs and corridors. And we're also looking at other ways to fill in that western side. So that is where the integrated hubs and corridors layer is at. Questions on that one? Well, those are my updates on those 4 things. So that's what's coming. We're shooting, so the official release stuff is going to be, I guess it'd be November, because we've got to wait till after the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So we're working on a bunch of cleanup stuff, not just some of these new products as part of the release, but you've probably seen we've got some new stories about how people are using a Southeast Blueprint, but we're working on a whole bunch of updated information on the website and copy. Hillary's been doing a lot of that. So not just fresh data layers, but also some sort of fresh and updated information on the website, and other things also should be coming along as we move into the fall. So with that, any other questions about any of this sweet goodness coming in the fall?
All right, sounds like not for now. I'm just going to take presenter power back for a second so that I can preview next month's webinar and give you some staff updates. So let me get my screen shared again. So next month's webinar is going to be on September 20th, same time, same connection information as today, and we'll be hearing from Amy Weldon with the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. So you guys may be aware that the ACJV has really prioritized efforts to advance coastal marsh conservation, and they're using kind of a flagship species approach. The idea behind this kind of narrow strategic focus is that it would help them better coordinate conservation action across states and partners in this particular really imperiled ecosystem. So Amy is going to go over basically how the joint venture selected that focus area and the approach that they're using to carry out their goals for coastal marsh, including how they're developing population and habitat objectives, developing conservation plans, and doing habitat prioritization. So if you're interested in birds or marsh or species distribution models or just how collaborative conservation efforts are connecting in the Southeast, this would be a great webinar to tune into. So a few updates. First off, greenways and trails indicators should be finalized next month. And I know I said that last month too, but we're running into some GIS challenges. So we're really, really close to having this indicator up on the CPA. Basically, in the review period, we heard feedback that we needed to do a couple of quick updates in Western North Carolina and in Florida, and Rua's already made a lot of progress in updating those greenway layers in OpenStreetMap, which we're using to make this indicator. And then but the methods, everyone seems really comfortable with the methods that we use to capture both the connected length of greenway networks and the naturalness of greenway conditions. So those methods are going to stay the same in the final indicator. So if you go to the CPA, that draft indicator is up and available. And unless you're in Western North Carolina or in Florida, that layer is exactly what you're going to see in the final. So just bear with us a little bit longer to get that final indicator up. That'll be incorporated in probably the next version of the South Atlantic and the Southeast blueprint. We're also starting to explore a finer resolution blueprint. Currently, the South Atlantic blueprint is at a 200-meter pixel resolution, but we're looking at ways that we can make that finer. Rua, do you want to comment or add any additional details on this?
I think it's more just kind of a heads up that that's something we're working on. We're getting a lot more interest and demand at trying to use the blueprint at a parcel level, and we're getting a lot better, more finer resolution information than we had at the beginning, where we started at fairly coarse pixels. But also, the third thing is we've got one of the big things was technical challenges of actually running the blueprint at fine resolution. And so we think we're going to be able to overcome some of those challenges. We'll still find out and be able to run it at a finer resolution. And so, so we're hoping in the next update we'll be able to have something a little finer resolution for you. We'll see.
Yeah, just letting y'all know that that's in the hopper. And then the last thing, Rua reminded me about that it might be a good idea to share with you guys some of the progress that we've made on the Southeast Conservation and Adaptation Strategy story map. We blogged about that in the last newsletter, but I thought while I had you all, I'd just give you a quick live demo. I'm going to SECAS here, which is the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy website. And as Rua alluded to, we're working on updating a lot of this text. But one thing that we already do have updated is this SECAS in Action story map, which really combines a lot of the latest and greatest success stories about how the blueprint and other cross-boundary products of SECAS have been implemented across the Southeast. So you'll see a lot of stories that you may know from the South Atlantic, like the Department of Interior Wildland Fire Resilient Landscapes funding that's highlighted in here, and some of the coastal wetlands grants that state wildlife agencies in the Southeast have used the blueprint to help support their proposals for. You may recognize some of these stories, but I bet that a lot of these will be new to you, ones outside the South Atlantic geography, from the Caribbean to the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks to the Gulf Coast Prairie and the Mississippi Gulf Hypoxia blueprints. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the Southeast, a lot of ways that SECAS and the blueprint itself are really making a difference on the ground. And so this is kind of our communications tool to help look at and learn more about those examples. Just wanted to highlight that this is available for you guys. And that's really all I have for staff updates. I typically like to end here on just reminding people how they can get involved in the blueprint. You can still join the South Atlantic LCC web community. You can always connect with your blueprint staff. That's me and Rua and Mallory and Amy and Louise and the whole crew here in Raleigh. And of course, we encourage you to explore the blueprint online, both the South Atlantic scale and the Southeast scale. And please reach out to us if you can think of any ways that you could use the blueprint to help inform your work. Does anyone have any additional questions before we wrap up here? We have plenty of time if something else has occurred to you about those updates or about Rua's presentation.
I actually, Hillary, this is Rua, have a quick update on the solar thing. because I'm going to go steal that.
Yeah.
Presenter power.
Steal away.
Your question, Linda. So I just want to show you, so this is actually a visual of solar farms across the South. This is kind of the central points of where they are. You can see a lot in Georgia, a ton in North Carolina, actually. And so I went, and again, this was a very quick and dirty analysis, just not looking at the area. This is just a center point. It doesn't give you the sort of full footprint area. But I did a quick analysis of the points themselves and where they're falling within the Southeast Blueprint. And of these solar farms, 30% were occurring in priority areas, and 10% were in high or highest priority areas. And so that was 55 different solar farms across just the South Atlantic. So I didn't look at the full Southeast Blueprint. That would have been even more, probably. But just within the South Atlantic region, Southeast Virginia up to North Florida, Coastal Plain and Piedmont, just within that area, 10% were higher, highest priority. So some pretty good stuff, and that's 55 different farms. So that's, just wanted to give you some more specific numbers since I couldn't. Hillary gave me a little time in between the next updates.
Stalling for you.
Yeah, good stall. Well stalled. So that's so far what we've found looking at some of these solar farms.
Rua, then, this is Linda. So I'm thinking about what we do with this, and who. I guess I need to answer these questions for myself in terms of who can people just buy up land for solar farms, regardless of what. I don't know who permits these things.
The permitting has been, so the original, what originally came, the reason I know about this mapping is from Christine Ellis, who's the Fish and Wildlife Service regional energy point person. And, it came from the context of concern that the permitting requirements for these solar areas as far as their conservation impacts are very, very lax. And so it was kind of part of the broader question that brings up to you is like, okay, well, looking at some of these places that are coming in really high quality habitats, what do we do about it? How is it going through the permitting process, or are there voluntary options that would help dissuade solar farms, or what do we do in specific spots? So yeah, that's where originally, at least these data came from.
Wow. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, folks? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, you're off the hook early. It's like 10:46, so enjoy the extra 15 minutes of your morning before 11 o'clock. And thanks so much for tuning in this morning. Thanks, Rua. It was a great presentation.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
See y'all.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.